I met her accidentally in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it tore me up every time I heard her drawl, southern drawl. Then I heard my dream, went back downstream, cavortin' in Davenport, and I followed you, Big River, when you called. Applejack bolted up like a shot in the pitch of the night. The blankets were sultry from sweat, and they clung like a leech's maw to her body as she shifted breathlessly to peer blindly into the darkness of her bedroom. Jerking in their sockets, her eyes sought for anything. A motion, an object, anything that could answer the question rolling through her mind. What was that? From the depths of sleep, something had yanked her back to consciousness and stifled the beating of her heart, which lay between quivering, oxygen-starved lungs. She dared not breathe as her ears tilted, straining for the source of her sudden awakening. Moments passed like hours, and slowly her breathing hissed in the silence. The room gradually cast itself in monochrome as her eyes adjusted to the slight light dripping through the curtains. It must have been a dream, just a nightmare that she couldn't remember. Some locked-away horror brought on from something she ate too close to bedtime. She eased down into her pillows again. She adjusted the sweaty blankets, which now lay cold against her, and was thankful that she could not remember whatever had given her such a fright. It felt as though her eyes carried sand within their lower lids as the blackness of sleep crept across her senses, numbing them to the world. First, her senses of smell and of taste ceased to take in the musk of the excess sweat. Then, her sense of touch dulled to the wet blankets. Her sight, already hindered behind the thick lids, accepted the oppressive darkness. Nearly removed from the realm of reality, her ears pitched in a final effort to register her surroundings. Gingerly, her ears recoiled, and settled to rest as the veil of sleep hung about her like a curse.
Help!
The voice was thick with accent, labored, liquid like a pneumonia sputter, and distant. It was nearly unperceivable, and was a pin drop to the nearly extinguished pony.
Applejack! Anyone! Please help me!
The mare's ears jerked and her senses blared, taking in everything at once while her heart pounded rapidly in her breast. Fully awake, Applejack leapt from her bed and staggered on her hooves. From what direction had the voice called? Who was it? She couldn't be certain, but she knew it had come from outside, so she quickly cantered down the stairs and erupted from the front door of her home, senses alive and pinging in all directions for the strangely familiar voice.
I'm drowning! Please!
The voice was cut off by a sickening gurgle and sputter. A deep wheezing gasp signified the owner had taken a large amount of water into their airway. From the forest came the suddenly deafening roar of the river, and Applejack galloped away from her home under the curtain of night and into the nearby forest. Trees seemed to appear out of nowhere as if they were suddenly sprouting before her, and she struggled not to crash into them. An unsettling chill slithered like wet tongues across her body from the unseen fog enveloping her. She was guided more by knowledge of her property than by her still adjusting vision, despite a half-moon ghostly glowing above. It seemed as though the forest resisted the light, and dismissed rationality. Had this always been the case? Applejack questioned herself. Was the forest always this dark at night? Pushing away the thoughts, the pony rushed deeper into the woods, and toward the frenzied rush of the river. Now she thought she could hear a frenzied splashing amidst the flowing river's white noise, and hoped not to hear them suddenly quieten. Her legs ached, and her heart winced in fear between rapid hammerings, and the distance to the river seemed unnaturally far. She had been to it many times in her life, and knew every twist and turn it took to get there. It also seemed strange that it was running so hard, drowning out all other natural nighttime sounds. She had rarely seen the river run violently enough to mute the cicadas, crickets, and other animals of the nocturnal world. She reprimanded herself for puzzling over such trivialities. Some pony was in danger.
Help! I can't breathe! I'm being pulled under! Help!
The voice called again, and Applejack almost recognized it this time. It was tinted with a familiar twang that most ponies of this area did not have, but, as if stricken from her memories, she simply could not place it.
I'm coming! Keep your head up! I'm coming!
She called through fear-laden and physically exerted lungs. The voice had been close, and she expected to burst into view of the owner at any moment, struggling against the rapid current. She didn't have time to question why the sound never seemed to come from another direction, but always in this singular spot. Again, it seemed the forest had grown larger than she could recall, and she feared her aching muscles, blistering lungs, or thrumming heart may abandon her cause before she could help the pony in distress. She could feel saliva on her cheeks from gasping for air open-mouthed, and the chill of the night was more like streamers of ice. Still running almost blind under the canopy of the forest, her sweat-coated body shivered from cold, and an almost luminescent fog filtered into her sight as she broke the tree line and slid to a halt on the river's pebbled shore. She stood fervently trying to catch her breath through cold inflamed lungs, eyes scouring wildly at the oddly calm body of water, lazily flowing before her.
What in tarnation?
Applejack's mind could not comprehend what was happening. The rushing noise of the river was replaced by the mundane sounds of the nighttime forest. How could this be when she had heard the thunderous roar just moments before? Still, her eyes tore across the river's black glass surface, and she could find nothing. She stood, shivering from the night's cold biting on her sweat-drenched body. She confusedly stepped into the water despite the gelid torment it displayed across her flesh. She waded out to her knees in the river and looked up and down its body in search of anything that could have called out to her. "Down here," it said from seemingly within her own head, and her heart seized for a moment as she looked dumbly down into the oil-black water. The abyss mirror gazed back at her with only the slender glittering of the moon's light caught in mere particles of time back at her. She was still gasping for breath, and the water was calm enough that the force of her breath sent tiny, oily ripples through the almost perfect black pane. The moon suddenly illuminated the water enough that Applejack stood peering at her own reflection. Uncertainty filled the mare, and she wondered if she could be locked in another nightmare, another dream that her mind would hide from her upon awakening. She could see the curve of her neck, the orange of her coat, and the straw blonde of her mane, reflected on the surface. The green of her eyes caught her attention. Somehow they seemed off, more pastel and darker. It was, she shuddered to think, as if they were dead. She frowned in confusion and closed her eyes tightly, feeling the warm, salty water of her tear ducts rinsing the emerald orbs. She opened them again, to find the reflection had changed remarkably. The reflection now stood imperfect, scowling back at her with a twisted grin. Pallid, sickly flesh hung in strands from her face and revealed desiccated strips of rotting muscle or bones stained brown. The dead eyes almost glowed in their sickly frosted green, and they lay unblinking in black, sopping sockets. The reflection grinned a ghastly, profane smile, and chunks of its face began to break off and rise up toward Applejack. The water's mirror rippled as the hunks of decrepit meat broke the plane and obscured the reflection. Applejack screamed and tried to turn to escape the water's icy grasp. However, the cold tongues which previously danced upon her hide froze her in place, it seemed, and she could not jerk her body free. Again she screamed as terror rent her mind and body.
"You're so sweet. Thank you for saving me."
The voice was garbled and sputtered sickeningly. It sounded as though its lungs were filled completely with the black water, and it ended with a despicable, gurgling laugh. Applejack began to sink. The water, which she knew should only be knee-deep, was swallowing her. She yanked her legs as the water licked at the edge of her belly. The mare pulled hard, every muscle straining for purchase of freedom, but her legs simply could not become unstuck. One of her legs separated from its socket as she struggled, and she howled in pain despite the freezing water swelling to overtake her shoulders. The babbling laughter was wet and thick in her ears, and as the water began to devour her chin, she could see the dead eyes reflecting inches away. Her frightened cries became muffled as the water took her into its bowels and suddenly ceased altogether, as it filled her lungs and stole what little oxygen remained. The last thing she heard as her vision dimmed was the laughter gargling and chortling like a babbling brook.